You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Proselytize or Apostatize. I'm your host, David Russell, along with my co-host, David Paulman. What's up, David?
How's it going, Russell? Great to be back with another episode.
Yes, we are joined with a special guest today. His name is Detective J.Warner Wallace. Hello, Jay. How are you?
So glad to be with you guys. Yeah, I'm doing good.
Yes.
Doing good. It's easy to keep you. So David, do you call David Russell? Is that what you do just to keep the difference between the two of you?
Oh, yeah. A lot of time. Yeah.
Russell.
Yeah,
makes sense.
Yeah, just like law enforcement, I'm always called by my last name anyway, so it's like,
right.
doing stuff like
Good.
that. But, Jay is a Dateline featured cold case detective, author and speaker, and senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview and an adjunct professor of apologetics at Talbot School of Theology. Is that right, Jay?
Mm-hmm.
All
That's
right.
right.
I was hoping I got that intro right there. Jay, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, what your ministry is focused on, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I followed in my dad's footsteps. He was also a detective before me, and my son now is a detective behind me. And so for the most part, I worked unsolved murders because we had a bunch of these going back to about 1972. So I opened a bunch of them up and tried to solve them. And, for most of my early career as a police officer, I was not a believer. I became a believer as a really a result of this process, learning how to determine if a witness is reliable and then applying that test. You can't help but do that, right? I mean, I didn't know any other way to analyze the Gospels. When I first bought a Bible, I was 35. And I think what we do is we end up taking whatever it is that we kind of our process. If you're an engineer, you might have a very analytic, puzzling kind of a mind. And so you're going to spend time puzzling like an engineer. By the way, we love engineers on juries. So a lot of that was the only process I knew was and I kind of figured, doesn't everybody have some way of, like, you wouldn't accept these claims of the New Testament without testing them, would you? I mean, that made no sense to me. So I figured everyone must do something that's similar to this, where they test the documents or test the accounts to see if they're real, if they're true. And that's what I tried to do with the skill set that I had as a cold case detective.
Right on. Yeah, I can't express enough your methodology in writing has really boosted the confidence in my faith, and I'm sure David is as well, right, David?
Oh, yeah. I mean, for me personally, it was huge. Let's see. I started questioning my faith, probably about 5-6 years ago now. And I came across the movie God's Not Dead 2, which had J.Warner Wallace was featured in it. And so I picked up pretty much, I think he only had 2 books out at the time. Anyway, I picked them both up. And Cold Case Christianity, I mean, that was huge for me. Really just because I say that book and Norman Geisler's Christian Apologetics were in some ways the two biggest books for me, because it wasn't so much like the content I was learning in these, because a lot of this stuff I already had knew from other apologetics books, but they were training me how to think. And so that is why, Cold Case Christianity was that was like a big stepping stone for me. So I appreciated that book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can tell you that if you get mentioned in the same breath with Norm Geisler, you're probably, because I felt the same way about Norm. I didn't really know what this thing was called Christian apologetics, when I first became interested in the Gospels. So I wasn't able to, I wouldn't have even known I barely knew to buy a Bible. This whole thing was so new to me. But years afterwards, probably maybe 5 or 6 years afterwards, I started working with young people. And I would try to explain to them this process that I went through. And I realized, I'm probably not alone in this. And somebody turned me on to, I think it was Norm's one of Norm's books. He's written like 80 books or something crazy like that. So I went out and I got it. I said, oh my gosh, this guy, there's like, I'm not doing anything new here, right? I mean, I may be coming at it from a slightly nuanced angle because I'm trying to apply these things these techniques that we apply in investigative work, but a lot of historical work, a lot of historians. You talked to Gary Habermas. A lot of Gary's approach is we may not use the exact same terminology, but a lot of what we're doing has similar feel to it. So I think I went out and got a bunch of stuff that Norm got, and now I'm still close friends with his son David. So I feel like Norm was one of those guys. He and C.S. Lewis were probably the first. Maybe C.S. Lewis was probably the first apologist I was introduced to. Mere Christianity. At some point, someone's going to give you Mere Christianity, right? But aside from that, Norm's work was really influential.
Yeah.
That's how, as a matter of fact, I met Frank Turek, who's a very good friend, was through the book that he wrote with Norm, I Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. So
Yeah, what's funny, though, is that you said C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity.
Yeah.
I had a friend, when I first started getting into apologetics, they gave me The Problem of Pain.
Yes.
And my mind was blown. I was like, what are these big words? What am I going to do?
I know. Well,
with this?
Well, I can tell you, it's frustrating. I have quoted Lewis a couple of times. Let me adjust my chair here. I've quoted Lewis a couple of times, right, in my books, and there's nothing more frustrating than having somebody quote you in your book, but actually they're quoting your quote of C.S. Lewis. That's how good his stuff is. They're not quoting me. I just happen to quote Lewis, and that's what gets drawn out as though I said it. And of course, anyone who knows anything about Lewis's work knows that I didn't say it. But I think it's a testimony to how powerful Lewis even is today in terms of his prose, how he wrote, the language he used, how he could turn a phrase, how he could take a simple concept and make it quite beautiful in the way he pitched it. So I think that's something that's for us to emulate for sure.
Yeah, it's kind of funny though, Jay. I've been listening to you since Please Convince Me, and then heard you on Greg Kokel's show, and I think David Paulman was probably in middle school about that time. So I feel old.
Yeah. Well, I do too. Trust me. My own son, who was with me in those, I got started in ministry because my kids were in the 6th and 7th grade. Now that he's 32 and contributing to our website and to our YouTube channel, I'm thinking, where's all this time going, right? I mean, it's time to step aside, let him do the job because he's certainly capable of doing it.
That's
so
awesome. That's awesome. But yeah, it when you're a parent, time flies. I have a 15-year-old.
Yeah, it does.
And a 14-year-old, and me and my wife now have a infant and a 5-year-old together. So it's when you have that range and you can see the little ones and then the big ones, you're like, man, where does the time go?
No, you're right.
So Jay, we asked you on because we wanted to talk about the authorship of the Gospels. There's quite often you'll get barraged by internet atheists about the anonymity of the Gospels. How can we, and what, being a law enforcement and applying those detective principles, how do you come at this overall? I mean, of course, we got specific questions here, and I'm going to hand that over to David here in a minute. But how do you approach this overall?
Okay, well, a couple things about it. There's a simple principle that was helpful for me, and it comes down to how early do we think we have an account? Because remember, it's easier to lie about a lot of things, and some of the details related to Jesus, and including the authorship of the Gospels, if you just wait hundreds of years before you release the first one. Right, because now there's nobody alive who could tell you if this stuff actually happened. It cannot be fact-checked by anybody. Anybody who was there to see what really happened is now dead. So if the dating of the Gospels is late, well, then there are some good reasons to have skepticism about whatever. But on the other hand, if they are early, it is far. So I think the early dating. And I do believe they are dated early for a number of reasons that are historical, that are in the text themselves, as you probably know if you read my books. I think there is good reason to believe these are early. And by the way, until scholarship of maybe the 1800s and 1900s, This was the not unanimous, but the overwhelming belief of biblical scholars. It really is the German school of biblical criticism that begins to open the door wide to all kinds of skepticism, founded not necessarily on document evidence, but founded instead on textual criticism. In other words, scholars trying to read between the lines, scholars who really have never ever interviewed witnesses professionally, to know how witnesses give statements and how they differ and what causes somebody to focus on a detail, what causes somebody to mistake a detail. These are things that you learn as you do the job, hit or miss, which, you don't want to learn it. You're going to learn it as a detective. And a lot of that, so I don't think a lot of that scholarship, I never listen to scholars, and you shouldn't listen to me either. Instead, go back to what the evidence is the scholars are talking about. And let's just look at it with your own eyes, with your own set of your own ideas, and see what you can deduce from it. We ask this of jurors all the time. Yes, we're going to bring in witnesses, and we're going to bring in experts who are going to testify. But remember, the other side is also going to bring in its set of experts. It's your job to go back to the evidence and see which of these two sets of experts you think is most reasonable given the evidence. We need to do the same thing when it comes to biblical authorship. So I think that one of the things that helped me was, look, there's a reason. If you look at the book of Acts, it is missing key significant details of history that you would expect Luke to include if they had already happened. So, for example, it happens in the area, much of the action in the book of Acts is around the area of Jerusalem, yet there's no discussion at all of the siege of Jerusalem in 68 or 69, and certainly no discussion of the destruction of the temple in 70. Even though Jesus had allegedly, even in Luke's gospel, predicted such a thing, why would you not then include the completion of Jesus's prediction if it had happened? That's a good starting point to ask the question, was this written prior to the events you would expect him to include? Well, also, he didn't include the death of Paul, early 60s, the death of Peter, early 60s, the death of James in 61, the death of Barnabas in about 61. These are key players in the book of Acts that are not described. Their deaths are not described, even though Luke takes the time to describe the death of James, the brother of John, who's a nobody, okay, compared to James, the brother of Jesus. Why would you leave these key and important historical facts out in a book that's allegedly supposed to cover this period of time? Well, if they haven't happened yet, you can't include them. And so I think there's good reason to believe the book of Acts is written prior to the first missing event, the death of James, who, remember, is a big deal. James led the church. He was the leader of the church in the first council the church ever assembled in Acts 15. I would expect to have James's death mentioned, especially the circumstances around James's death, which we now have. So I would say that's something that would help you to date this early. Also, it's not as though we have any manuscript evidence that dictates a late dating. As a matter of fact, even Gary, who you had on the show, would tell you, because we've asked Gary this, I've talked to Gary about this at length, look, is there some kind of manuscript reason why people date post-70 for any of the Gospels? And he says, no, it's that, number one, they don't believe that Jesus could accurately predict the gospel, so they want to place the prediction post-destruction of temple, so that therefore the author is just saying that Jesus predicted something he already knew occurred. That is a bias against predictions, against the supernatural ability to prophesy, that's driving that kind of dating. Also, they don't believe in miracles, so they want to say that, hey, these miracles couldn't have occurred, so clearly this is written late, because anybody would, who would still be alive would be able to tell you that didn't happen. So it's a bias against the miraculous, including prophecy, that really drives a lot of this kind of skepticism. So in the end, some of the authorship and dating of these Gospels, I think, is if we just follow the evidence where it leads and don't allow our presuppositional bias against the miraculous to stop us, you're going to find these are early dated. And if they're early dated, that does make it very hard. I'm more inclined then to take the earliest attributions of authorship, because it's harder to lie about these things if they are occurring early. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm gonna let David ask his first question over here, because he had a list over here of his own, and it's kind of, you gave us the broad spectrum there.
Yeah.
But we're gonna get specific and ask why now. Like, what do you mean? So okay, David, go for it.
What I love though is how you like keep that long of a train of thought perfectly, and like it just comes out like in perfectly logical order. Like I can't do that, so I admire that.
Well, let's just talk about that for a second. That's a good point. Like a lot of the reason why if they're one of us who's listening to this right now, there is something for which they could make a continuing argument, something in their life. For example, this is going to date this recording, but on Saturday they traded Jared Goff from the Rams to the Detroit Lions for Matt Stafford. They switched quarterbacks and gave a couple draft picks. Now there are people right now who are on the air in Los Angeles who can make an extended case going back through the entire history of Jared Goff's playing in the NFL as to whether he should have been traded or should not have been traded. And they can connect all of those dots with all of the coaches he ever had and all of the record for every year he played. Really, a lot of us can do something like that. There's some aspect of your life, of our lives, that we are so interested in that we can make a continuous argument, or present the case for. So what I would say is a lot of us, if we're just so geeked out on Scripture and on the case for Christ that, yeah, so I could probably make this case better than I can make the case for Jared Goff. I hope.
That is awesome. And yes, before we get into like the specific questions here, I do think it's important that we kind of situate this particular issue when we're talking about the authorship of the Gospels, right?
Yeah.
So there are some people who treat this as like if they aren't written by the traditional authors, then like the case for Christianity, it's just dead. Like it's not there. Like you've got to have this. And there was a time I kind of felt like that. Do you think that that's a mistake, though? That like because we don't normally make it a requirement that historical documents be written by eyewitnesses, especially for our ancient sources. So, although I think it's an important issue, it's not like a linchpin issue. Would you agree with that?
Okay, so I have a slightly nuanced, different view of this. I don't care who wrote it. The question is, was it written by somebody who was there to see what it is they said they saw? So it wouldn't matter to me who wrote this thing. The question is, does it contain evidence that it's written by somebody who was actually there to see what they said they saw? So I'll give you an example of this. People have debated about whether or not is John really the author of the Gospel of John? Or is it a different John? This is also argued as far as the authorship of 1 John or 2 John, right? Is it this elder John, or is it John the apostle who wrote it? Don't care. Don't care. Either one of those two would have been an eyewitness, apparently. And what I'm concerned as is it an accurate, testable, reliable eyewitness account? It wouldn't matter to me, but it strikes me as odd that if I am going to call these 4 canonical Gospels eyewitness accounts, and I'm going to falsely attribute names to their accounts, that I would pick Mark in the first place, that I would pick Luke, and that these are not, there's no claim in history that Mark or Luke were eyewitnesses to Jesus. Luke clearly tells you he's not in the opening lines of his Gospel. He has to consult with eyewitnesses. So if I'm trying if you're going to falsely attribute names to these, wouldn't you falsely attribute somebody else's name? Why wouldn't you make it the Gospel of Philip? There is a gospel, a non-canonical late Gospel of Philip. It seems to me that the earliest Gospels, you don't want to slap the names of people you thought would. Instead, they boldly simply put the name on the Gospel of who actually authored it, even though 2 of those 4 Gospels, it's a lame choice. It's like it's not the most compelling choice to say this is written by some dude named Mark. Yeah, Mark. If you don't, for example, if you were in the possession of the Gospel of Mark in antiquity, but you weren't aware of the Book of Acts, how would you even know who Mark is to the overall story? Stick somebody else, make that the Gospel of Peter. I think it actually contains the eyewitness account of Peter. Let's just call it Peter. Wouldn't that be better if you're going to false? But the problem is that Peter didn't write it. Mark did, and they went out on a limb and actually gave it the attestate. They attested this to the actual author, and I think that's a far better and more reasonable inference from the evidence.
Oh yeah, and I completely agree with you there. So, kind of, what's the brief overview then? What is like the case, the positive evidence then for the traditional authorship of the Gospels?
Okay, so the earliest attestation of church fathers is that these 4 Gospels were written by these 4 men. If, for example, you found equally ancient manuscript evidence that they were calling these under some other name, I would want to consider that. And I think I would be, okay, so why, first question is, why do I doubt the traditional authorship? Given that two of these names are lame, I would probably pick somebody else if I was trying them. And number two, there is no manuscript evidence that points that there is some other attestation than the ones we have. And there's lots of good internal evidence. I made a list here, so that's why I pulled it up here. I wanted to refer to it. So I'll give you an example of Mark. Let's just use Mark, because Mark is so, in some ways, controversial, I think. Number one, is it the earliest? Is Matthew the earliest? There's some controversy about that. Number two, it has an ending that seems to have been added. Several verses were added to the end, so there's some controversy about that. Number three, there's no birth narrative in Mark, so there's some controversy about that, right? So let's just start with Mark. Why would we believe? Well, okay. Well, first of all, Papias described Mark's gospel as the notation of Peter's preaching or Peter's teaching. So I'll read to you from this history we have, the Ecclesiastes history, book 2, chapter 15. And the elder used to say this: Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that he remembered, not indeed in order of the things said and done by the Lord, for he had not heard the Lord, nor had followed him, but later on followed Peter. Again, if you're going to make this stuff up, wouldn't you say that he just heard it? Now you're actually going out on a limb to say, look, this is a guy who wrote this. He didn't actually hear the Lord, and he heard Peter, who used to give teaching as necessity demanded, but not making, as it were, an arrangement of the Lord's oracles, so that Mark did nothing wrong in thus writing down single points as he remembered them. For to one thing he gave attention, to leave out nothing of what he had heard and to make no false statements in them. Nothing of what Mark had heard from Peter. So there's the earliest attestation we have is from Papias, and it describes Mark as the author of this gospel, and that Mark is scribing for Peter. Irenaeus said the same thing and against heresies. So that's about 130 to 200. Justin also said the same thing. I could cite these, but I won't. Clement also said the same thing, and that's pretty early. This is in a book he called Hypotyposius, and then also Eusebius wrote about it. Tertullian affirmed it. The Muratorian fragment, which is one of the earliest records we have of any set of scriptures from the Christian era, also has this attested to Mark. And Origen also said that it was Mark writing for Peter. Even the Antimarcionite prologue, another early list, another early description of Christian writings, lists Mark as the author scribing. Now, so that's, you have some external manuscript evidence that points early. My question is, it's so consistent early and over history pointing back to Mark. So the question then becomes, well, why do we doubt it then? Why do we doubt this is Mark? So that's first thing. I think there's also internal evidence in the Gospel of Mark that we talked about in Cold Case Christianity, right? The fact that he starts with Peter, he ends with Peter. He seems to describe things that only Peter would know, and he always leaves out the most embarrassing details of Peter's life in order to kind of protect his mentor. There's lots of good reasons to believe that Peter's words are contained within the Gospel of Mark. I won't go into all those because those are in the book, but so I've also written about these. You can get for nothing at all. Just type in Gospel of Mark on our website, and you'll see all of the articles we posted there to help you. That's what I'm kind of reading from, just reminding myself of all these quotes from the earliest church fathers who talk about this. I think a more difficult maybe is John, right? Because it comes later in history. There are times when people would try to attribute scholars very late in history. And you'll notice this too. The earliest struggles about authorship, I mean, if you look at the history of Christianity, struggles, doubts, concerns, and questions about authorship are not occurring at the earliest points in that timeline. They're occurring late in the timeline. That's always interesting to me. You'll also see that so I just think that if we're going to start to argue these are some other authorships on the basis of language, and typically language and words that are used within the manuscript, I think we need to be careful about that. That's all. I just don't think that's necessarily, especially when all of history has been pointing in a different direction. Let's go back to John for one last minute. I think if John was written by somebody other than the Apostle John, it would not in any way impact whether or not I don't care if it was somebody who was never even in that disciple group or that apostle group. It's interesting to me that a lot of skeptics will say, well, I can't believe the scriptures that are written by people who would be inside the inner circle, right? Yet, if this is not the Apostle John, then this is a gospel written by somebody who's outside the inner circle, and you don't want to trust that either. So you can't win either way, right? So I think a lot of this is about, it doesn't matter to me if that was the elder John and not the Apostle John. The question is, do I think it's written by somebody who actually saw this? That's really the question.
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it as well. And I always find it interesting too that when people are skeptical of traditional authorship, they never have a better candidate in mind. They just like to reject the traditional author. But yeah, now you hit on the Gospel of John a little bit, and so maybe you would say you've already answered this, but there's an issue here of how late that gospel is traditionally dated, right? It's put in the 90s sometimes, or even later. And it seems like that would require that if we're going to say this was John the Apostle, and I know you said it doesn't have to be him, but if it was him, then it seems like he would have to live to a really old age, which old even by our standards, and especially for back then, that would be extremely rare. Would you just go back to your point that it as long as it's by an eyewitness, that's okay, or would you even have maybe a specific answer on if it was the Apostle John?
Okay, so I think that you're right about for some of the same reasons why I would argue that the Book of Acts is pre-destruction of the temple. I would also argue that the Gospel of John falls in that same time range. Maybe it's later, maybe it's closer to 70 AD. I think it is much closer to 70 AD than it was the Gospel of John. But I do not think it is necessarily late. Let me pull up my notes on this as well. I've written about this also at Cold Case Christianity, that I do think it's later. I just don't think it's late. And there's a big difference there. And I think that, okay, let's see here. Let me, pardon me for not having this pulled up before we...
No, you're fine.
This show's really laid back, so take your time.
No problem. Sometimes when I'm on a line, we do this. Okay, here we go. So this article I'm talking about is one I wrote that's called John's Gospel May Have Been Last, but it wasn't late. Now, we do know from the same kinds of sources we have in the early church that talked about Mark's authorship, also talk about John's authorship, and they talk about it being the last of the four Gospels that are written. So you'll see this even from Eusebius and prior, that even the church fathers will identify John's Gospel as being later. This does not mean it's late in history. It just means it's of the four canonicals, of the three canonicals, and the three synoptics and the one canonical left over John. They're just arguing that John's comes later than the rest. Okay, well, I'm with you on that as well. But I don't think it's late. That's a big difference to say something it came in last as to whether it came in late. I'm turning off my phone here so not to bother us on this. It's pretty clear that, and I'll just give you the argument I make online, that John wrote as though his readers already knew and were familiar with the apostles in the Synoptic Gospel. So there's good reason to believe it comes after for that as well. And there's also good reason to believe as though that he already knew that. Look how it opens. It opens as though you already know who John the Baptist is. It really assumes many pieces of the Synoptic Gospels are already well attributed and well distributed. So that's another reason why I think you could say it's late. And it seems pretty clear also that the other Gospels are not writing as though they're familiar with John's. So I think there are good reasons to believe that John's Gospel is later than the Synoptics. But because of what it includes some details related to certain fountains in the vicinity of Jerusalem that were destroyed during the siege of Jerusalem. And it writes as though these things are still in place and could be visited by the reader when in fact we know by 70 AD these things were going to be destroyed. It never mentions the destruction of the temple. It never mentions the siege of Jerusalem. It never mentions the fulfillment of those prophecies that predicted those things. So I would make the same argument for the pre-70 dating of John. Now, I have listed here, I want to see where I put these. Let's see. There are, I have a list, and I'm not sure what article it's on, that provides you with the biblical scholars who would agree with my early dating. And there are a number of these. But what happens is that you'll never hear about these biblical scholars, which you typically hear. I'll give you an example of this. What makes the headlines most are those scholars who argue that Christianity is wrong, false, or misunderstood. The traditional scholars on this never get a hearing anymore. If you write a book that argues that the scriptures are unreliable, that's going to sell at a tenfold the amount that a book that argues for the traditional or the most ancient dating or attributions of the Gospels. So what sells right now, and what grabs the attention of the populace right now, are those people who would try to say, hey, Christianity is not true. But there are a number of scholars historically who have attributed the Gospels to these traditional authors and have done so at an early date. And I'll find that before we get off today. I'll find that article. But let me give you a couple of things also, kind of internal reasons that I think that you could argue that the early dating of the Gospels. Okay, I told you about the not mentioning the temple being destroyed. That's one of them. John also uses some kind of interesting early primitive terms and titles. He uses words in the text that are consistent with the earliest description of these folks in Christianity. So, for example, he never calls the disciples apostles, as Luke does in the book of Acts. Instead, he always terms them disciples, which is the earliest reference, earliest use of that term that predates even the way they were talked about in the book of Acts. He also talks about that, like one of the pools I was talking about is the pool of Bethesda, right? That's a pool that in chapter 5, it's in verse 2, you will see there's a description where it says, there in Jerusalem by the sheep gate, a pool, the one called Bethesda in Hebrew, which has 5 porticos. He uses the present tense form is. There is a pool present there. But that pool was destroyed in 70 AD. So it's another little piece that argues that he's talking about something in present tense because he's writing it prior to 70 AD. So what I think is happening here is that, yes, it's late. It's later than all the rest, but it's still earlier than the destruction of the temple. And that's why I think you can make this case. So that article online, so those who are interested, is John's Gospel may have been last, but it wasn't late. And I give you paragraphs for each one of these arguments, and you can take a look and see what you think for yourself.
Wow, yeah, that is, it's a very radical thesis, but it's very interesting, the case that you build for that there. And that kind of ties in directly to our next question here, which is, kind of what is the scholarly consensus on the Gospels? And if my own studies on this are right, then the scholarly consensus, it doesn't really stand where you do. Should that be a concern to you? And if not, why not?
And just to piggyback on that, I've heard a lot of this in dialoguing with atheists and other non-believers that say, well, the scholarly consensus says this, and I'm always in the back of my mind, is there some list out there that has all the New Testament scholars on it, and you're just able to reference that? I often ask the question,
including dead ones.
I often ask the question, what do you mean by consensus? Do you have this list?
What do you mean by scholars? So what you're really saying is you think there are some biblical authorities, people who understand enough about the manuscript evidence and about what these things say to be able to weigh in on their dating and attribute. And all this comes down to is, forget about the dating for a second. Are these reliable testaments, or reliable documents that describe the life of Jesus, written by people? And so my question would be, well, do you count any of the earliest Christian leaders as scholars? Of course you don't.
Yeah. Well, no Christian can be a scholar because they're all biased.
That's right. So that means already you've eliminated any of the earliest people who were earliest to the action, who might actually have, within a generation of the actual writing, something to say about who wrote them and what actually happened in that region. So instead, typically what people say about scholarly consensus is number one, who are the scholars? Now, I say this all the time in criminal trials. My scholars, my expert witnesses are going to be the worst that the jury is going to see. Why? Well, because I'm working high-profile cases with suspects rather, that typically have enough money to hire the best. So when you hire Robert Shapiro, and I've done trials with Robert Shapiro, well, you're going to get the best experts in that field. So if I bring in a forensic expert, trust me, their paid forensic expert's going to be a lot more credentialed than mine. My guy is just a guy I got for free who works at the county lab. That's what we did. We don't have a budget for this. We're the prosecutor side. We're using taxpayer money. So we're going to call in an expert we got at the county for free. And he's going to come in and testify what that DNA indicates. Meanwhile, the other side is going to pay for the best expert in the country. He's going to fly in from someplace across the country, and he's going to testify with far better credentials, far better pedigree, far better degrees. So, and by the way, he is going to say the exact opposite of what my guy says. Understand? And by the way, I've had this happen even when afterwards we found the guy guilty and he confessed to it. After the trial, he confessed to the actual crime. So it doesn't, now, by the way, that set of experts then, I guess, wasn't telling us the truth, or they were wrong, I guess, right? Because now we know what he did because he told us what he did. So the question becomes, well, okay, well, how do I even judge between scholars? I would say read them all, but what people make the mistake of doing is reading the scholars' view related to evidence without ever themselves going back to the evidence to see what the evidence is. You have to do that heavy lifting. I know it's easier for us just to find a scholar we can trust. So one of the articles I wrote here is how early are the biblical accounts of Jesus? It's online. I posted it again this year. I've updated it. And I just talk about why there are things that occurred in history, either manuscripts, people who wrote about it, that push the dating of the Gospels earlier and earlier and earlier. At the very end of the article, you'll see that I have a list of scholars, which I'm just going to butcher and ruin their names. One is Giuseppe Ricciotti. He's an Italian Bible scholar. He wrote a book called The Life of Christ and Paul the Apostle. He's going to date the Gospel of Matthew from 50 to 55 AD, the Gospel of Mark from 55 to 60 AD, the Gospel of Luke near 60 AD, and Gospel of John, he actually puts post 70, but he puts it prior to 100, which makes him pretty old, but that's okay. John Arthur Thomas Robinson is an Anglican bishop, New Testament scholar. He wrote Redating the New Testament in a book in 1963 called Honest to God. He rejects a lot of the liberal kind of form criticism that preceded him, and he uses an approach in his research which is similar to the approach I'm using, and he concludes the Gospels are written here. Matthew about 40 to 60 AD, Mark 45 to 60 AD, Luke 57 to 60 AD, John 40 to 65 AD. John Wenham, a professor of New Testament Greek and a Bible scholar, he wrote Redating Matthew, Mark, and Luke, a fresh assault on the synoptic problem. He concludes the Gospel of Matthew is around 40, Mark around 45, Luke around mid-50s. Birger Gerhardsson, a Swedish biblicist, professor at Lund University, he wrote The Reliability of the Gospel Tradition. He concludes the gospel should be dated also very early. His book is very interesting. Marcel Jousse, Jousse, a Bible scholar from France, he also places them very early. I should know Jean Carbonac, but I'm not sure I'm saying that right. He wrote a book called The Birth of the Synoptic Gospels. He's a scholar in Hebrew language. Here's what he says. He says that Mark is around 42 to 55, Matthew 50 to 60, Gospel of Luke 50 to 60. This is just the synoptics. That was his expertise. Philippe Roland, a biblical scholar from France, also he puts Matthew as the first at 40 AD. Then translated into Greek from 63 to 64, along with the Gospel of Luke. He also argued that the Gospel of Mark appeared from 66 to 67 in John. He also puts, though later, he puts it near 100 in the 90s. Again, that would make John a pretty old guy. He also, the one last, Karsten Peter Thied, German papyrist. He basically, an archaeologist, also a New Testament scholar. He wrote something called the Jesus Papyri, and he's looking at Matthew and concludes there right around 60 AD. So a lot of the early dating that I'm trying to argue for, just looking at internal evidence and what's missing in certain gospels, what is included in certain gospels. I mean, again, but here's the difference. I am not holding a presuppositional bias against the possibility that Jesus actually accurately predicted the destruction of the temple. And for a lot of people, and this is what Gary Habermas was telling us years ago when we first met with him, that what is driving the late dating, and I've written about this also on our website, I'll give you the name of that article as well, is really driven more by a presuppositional bias against prophecy and miracles more than anything else. Let's see. I think, let me see if I can find that article for you too. Sorry, you can ask me another question. I'll find it.
Well, I think you're asking like the perfect question, namely who counts as the scholars? Because I was in a conversation with an atheist just last week, as a matter of fact, and he told me no self-respecting historian would ever believe in a miracle. And so I had to ask him, well, what do you mean by a self-respecting historian? Because his criteria basically excluded anyone who believed in a miracle from being a self-respecting historian. So there's sometimes they'll just reject anyone who disagrees with them as being a legitimate scholar, because like the criteria is just gerrymandered to rule that out. So that is the perfect question of, who counts?
Who counts? Yeah, I'll tell you something else. I remember years ago watching, you remember the debate that William Lane Craig had with Christopher Hitchens at Biola. And I think it was that debate, or maybe one similar to it, where Hitchens starts off by basically asking I think it was William Lane Craig, do you believe in the virgin conception of Jesus? And William Lane Craig said yes. And Hitchens pretty much looked at the audience and said, I rest my case. Because in other words, to him, it seems so patently ridiculous that anyone would believe in such a supernatural event that there's no point in even saying any more. There's no point in even having this discussion any further. If you believe in that kind of thing, you're just not even, what's the point in having this discussion? You're an idiot. That's kind of his view. And I think that's so what, in addition to Gary, Daniel Wallace is you have no Daniel. He's a scholar. He's got an amazing personal story as well. He went to he teaches at Dallas Theological, and he's got an organization that preserves and photographs ancient texts, so these will not be lost to us. And he travels all over the world taking high quality photographs of ancient manuscripts of the New Testament. And we asked him one year too. We were out there at an event, and he was lecturing. And we just asked the question, what's driving this? Is it manuscript evidence that drives this drive toward late dating? I wrote an article called There's No Good Reason to Deny the Early Dating of the Gospel. It does not mean that there aren't reasons to deny the early dating of the Gospels. There's just no good ones, because they're all driven, even according to Daniel, by this presuppositional bias against the supernatural.
All right, but here's kind of an interesting one that comes up a lot, and this gets back to the authorship of the Gospels. You mentioned that I think Papias is our earliest source,
yes.
And so Papias is, if you go read his account, kind of a problem seems to come up, namely that he places Matthew chronologically prior to Mark. So he seems to identify Matthew as being the first gospel that was written. Moreover, he seems to get the language wrong, right? He says he doesn't say what language, but presumably it's Hebrew or Aramaic. But Matthew is in Greek, and it seems to be dependent on the Gospel of Mark, which makes most people date the Gospel of Matthew afterwards. If this is our this is our earliest source, right? I mean, this is probably one of our most important sources for authorship. First of all, doesn't that really undercut his testimony, at least on Mark and Matthew, and plausibly on the others as well?
Okay, I am pretty ambivalent about Mark and Matthew. I'm not sure myself which one of those two I would put first. And I think a lot of scholars who even date these things early are debating about whether Mark is first or Matthew is first. And a lot of that may simply be, I don't know. I don't think it matters. To be honest, I just don't think it matters which one of those came first. There's definitely these two authors know of each other's work. I'm not a big fan of the Q document as a precursor. I don't know there's really a need to necessarily have a Q document prior. I mean, if the Q document may simply just be the oral tradition, right? Now, I know that sounds crazy to a lot of people because they don't think there can be an oral tradition that's established well enough that would actually be repeated by everyone, right? Like, now, remember, even where you see borrowing from Mark to Matthew or Matthew to Mark, there are small changes, which you could argue are just, over time or language or copying of manuscripts. Perhaps there's some small changes. They're not exactly always word for word, but they're close enough where I would say it's clear that either one author is aware of the work of the other, or both are aware of some source that precedes them. Now, of course, the question is, what's the source that precedes them? Does it need to be a written source? We don't have any evidence of a written source. I think what we're probably referring to is the oral tradition. Now, you might say to yourself, there's no way. There's just no way there could be like such a robust oral tradition involving thousands of words that we find in the text of the New Testament Gospels. But I think that misunderstands the nature of not just the culture, but the kinds of witnesses we're talking about. So, for example, there are times when we'll find a witness 30 years later in a case, and that witness will maybe that person was afraid of what might happen to them if they told the truth, or that person was afraid of the suspect who's still living, would they're never going to come forward because they're afraid of the suspect, whatever. And they'll make some really important, powerful, detailed statement about what happened on the day of the murder. And you're thinking to yourself, well, really? So 30 years ago, you saw this, and now you want me to believe that you're accurately retelling it to me 30 years later. But it turns out one of the questions we'll say is, well, okay, so did you ever tell this to anybody else? Oh, my husband. I have been talking about this for 30 years. And my brother-in-law who was there, and my mom, I've been taught. So we're going to go talk to those people. And sure enough, it turns out that they've been talking about this a couple times a year. It gets brought up for 30 years. And they can recall it going back 30 years. So it's one thing for somebody to see something and then wait and talk about it for the first time 30 years later. Write it down. Okay, that's pretty rough. It's another thing, though, if they've been commissioned they've been told that blessed are those who will believe this, but didn't see it themselves, but will believe it, Thomas, through your testimony. And then the minute that Jesus goes, what is their testimony in the book of Acts? For 30 years. It's the Gospels over and over and over again, early. That's the gospel. That was their testimony. All the things that Jesus said and did. Peter talks about it from the very first sermon at Pentecost. He did all these, and by the way, they were talking about these things, I'm sure, consistently for 30 years. Now, that's different because that group was commissioned to share the gospel through their personal testimony, as you see when Jesus talks to Thomas about this. And I think that's a very different set of words. And it strikes me as quite reasonable that group that might have said it in look, Paul and Silas were together. There's pairs, pairing. You're constantly, if you've ever dealt with Mormon missionaries who have been together for a year, usually they are together for about a year. They have a 2-year mission. They'll be together overlapping for about a year. Then that one goes, next one comes in for a year. Now he's mentored by the older one. Well, it turns out when you talk to these folks, they basically tell you the same stuff because for a year they've been listening to each other share the Mormon gospel. Well, these groups were sharing the story of Jesus over and over and over again from the moment he ascended until the first scripture is read. That oral tradition is not somebody 30 years after the fact who for the first time now is having to recall what happened at the Sermon on the Mount. It's not happening like that. So I do think that there is a prior source of information that each gospel author taps into, but I'm not convinced it's a document. I think it's just the collective memory and the oral tradition.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that is that's an interesting point, and I like that. Yeah. Sorry, Russell, you want to say something?
That was good. Yeah, I agree. Just to the oral tradition, just to the parts of the oral tradition. I have a guy that I work with. He's from Kyrgyzstan, and they have a gentleman. He's, I guess, we would call him kind of like a seer or a wise man or whatever, but he's an orator. And he has a history of the Kyrgyzstan people that he recites verbatim. It's like 6 books, and he does it in like song form. And that's his only job in the community, is to do that. And, you know, I was blown away that this still happened. You know, I didn't think we lived in that type of world anymore where that stuff still goes on. But to see my friend like light up when I'm telling him about how the Gospels were originally orated, he was like, you know, he ran over to the computer, looked it up, and showed me the guy. And you can actually see him on YouTube. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think that's something we take. I know that there's an argument that, you know, the tradition was such that everything is being taught, but no, people wrote stuff down. I actually think there's a reason why the gospel authors didn't write it down as early as they could have, because clearly they could have written it down the first day. They could have written it down. Hey, before you go, we got 40 days with you, Jesus, after the resurrection, but Acts chapter 1. Can we just sit down and write some stuff down?
Writing
I
was
actually think
expensive
there's
too.
good. Yeah, I think there's a good reason to believe, though, that these folks thought that Jesus was going to come back in their lifetime. I mean, you can kind of see that undercurrent in New Testament documents, in books and letters in the New Testament. Like, hey, we're in the last days here. That was 2,000 years ago, okay? So, I mean, there's a sense in which I think these folks, and it's not a coincidence probably, you know, James, the brother of John, is martyred around 44. And now I think those gospels start showing up shortly thereafter. I think when you see that the apostles are starting to die, the chief commissioned eyewitnesses, then I think it's like, okay, maybe it's time to start writing this stuff down.
Yeah.
I don't think that's probably a coincidence. That's probably.
I would definitely agree there on that point, because, yeah, I don't see it. Yeah, I can see your point exactly. Yeah. David, you want to ask the next one? I know you have the other question there.
Yeah, this issue, it gets brought up a lot in questions over the resurrection, but I'm curious if we can use this additionally as an argument for the reliability of the Gospels. If, like, we take traditional authorship and eyewitness testimony here to be established to some extent, what about the martyrdoms of the apostles, right? That often gets brought up in, you know, reference to the resurrection here, right? People, they wouldn't die if they didn't genuinely believe this. Does that also give us a reason to suspect that the Gospels are reliable? Because does it seem reasonable that people would be martyred over these stories if they didn't also believe them?
Okay, so I don't think that the statement that people don't die for what, there are lots of people who die for what is a lie. That's just, it happens all the time. I mean, people die for what is a lie. But that's different. They're always well after the. It's one thing for people to fly planes into buildings centuries later, trusting that something is true, for which they have no firsthand information. Okay, people do this all the time. They will die for what they have no firsthand information. They just believe that it's true on the basis of any other number of reasons. But when you have a group that's willing to die when they have firsthand information that it's either true or false, that's different. So I would say, and this is why you have all the time, you'll hear skeptics will say, well, no, listen, lots of people die for lies. Well, yeah, but they're not eyewitnesses. They don't even claim to be eyewitnesses. They claim to be century later believers. This is a different group. I don't think that anyone's martyrdom has any evidential value outside of the life of eyewitnesses. So although there's a history of martyrdom in early Christianity up until at least the Edict of Milan, and certainly by the Edict of Thessalonica. But okay, so those are people who died in the 2nd century. I couldn't give a rip about those people. I'm sorry. I mean, I think it sure speaks for the conviction of early believers, but it doesn't speak for the truth nature of the documents. Only the disciples' deaths would speak to that. And what you'll see is, and a good way to kind of compare this, is that there are allegedly eyewitnesses to the golden plates in the Book of Mormonism, the Book of Mormon. So you have the golden plates that allegedly Joseph Smith translated. 3 eyewitnesses are listed, the earliest eyewitnesses, David Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris. Okay, these three people at some point said, well, they didn't actually see them. They backed off the claim that they saw the plates with their physical eyes and said they saw them with their spiritual eyes. If you look at the testimony of these folks, the manner in which they eventually were convinced that these plates existed is pretty tortured. Okay? And these folks were either at some point left the church for a season. You don't leave claims if they are this powerfully true and you saw it with your own eyes. That is something I think is harder to explain. So the question then really becomes, do we have good reasons to believe that the apostles, those who would have seen the real Jesus, number one, did they really live and did they really die? Now, the best source for this is my buddy Sean McDowell's book, right? And I think that book is getting cheaper and cheaper all the time. The reason why I say that is that originally it was a PhD thesis, and I'm looking at it right now on Amazon to grab the price. I want to give him a shameless plug here because I think this work is excellent because it's so fair. The Fate of the Apostles. Okay, now it's like a $50 book. Okay, it's still, that's pretty high, right? But it's great. And the reason why
it's not
when you had gift cards.
It was like $120 back when I got it freshman year.
I know, right? So, but what's great about it is when he first started his PhD, I was getting ready to write a series on the Fate of the Apostles. And I don't know how we discovered that we were on the same wavelength, but I brought over I had started to purchase resources for this. So you purchase all the popular resources first, which are okay. But those popular resources will then have a bibliography. And I started to purchase the first set of bibliographies. And those books will have bibliographies. So I had like 3 generations of these books that I was purchasing. And I just put them all in a big box and I brought them to Sean. And I know that was just his starting point. I don't even think he probably used any. He probably went like 3 more. And now you're looking at the most ancient manuscripts we have in which the death of the apostles is described. And what you'll find yourself looking at is realizing, okay, there is a grade. You could put a grade. I first saw Michael Patton do this, put a grade on each death of the apostles from A to D. How certain can we be this is true? That gets an A. If you're not certain at all, that gets an F. You know, and so you can be very certain about much more. Let's put it this way: you can be much more historically certain about the death of Peter than you can, for example, the death of Philip. So what John does is he's just honest about it. What I look at is say, okay, again, do we have manuscript evidence that argues for different kinds of deaths? Do we have anyone who says, I actually got a hold of Philip, and after 3 days of being tortured, he told me it's a different story? Do we have anybody ever recanting early in history? Don't think for a second that wasn't happening and wasn't happening early. Pliny the Younger was doing this very early in Christian history, getting people to argue that they would bend their knee to a Roman god now, which they didn't want to do. So basically, they were saying, yeah, okay, I'm not. That it's a form of recanting, really, right? If you'll say, I'm now willing to worship their Roman gods. And by the way, when he wrote to Trajan and talked about that, it's like, okay, it's like a feather in your cap. I got Christians to recant in some way.
Yeah. That's why they're confessors.
Yeah, I would expect that if this is happening amongst the disciples, the original disciples, this would be big headline news, and you'd want to have that out there. But there isn't such a document out there. So so again, I get it. You could say, well, those kinds of documents are lost, but on what evidence do you have that those ever existed in the first place? This is my whole point. Like, what are you basing this on? So there are lots of good reasons to believe that, if nothing else, there is an early apostolic tradition of martyrdoms. And I've written about that. Can we trust the early traditions of apostolic martyrdoms? And you'll see that I hope that kind of helps get people started thinking about whether or not these are reliable. So, for example, they are not. I don't think they're imperfect. I think the manuscript evidence, the historical evidence for the martyrdom of the apostles, is irregular and at best. It's up and down. It's good and bad. So I would simply say, okay, is there any counter evidence to this? I don't see it. So that's one aspect of this. And number two, it turns out that the claims that you see being made in the second generation of followers, the students of the eyewitnesses, they have a similar commitment to martyrdom that they got from somewhere. Where did they get it from? Well, they got it from the eyewitnesses. So the best explanation for the behavior of the second and third generation Christians is that they learned this from what at least we know now, as the claims that the apostles were martyred. If that happens in front of you, that would explain why people were willing to go to their death in the second and third generations. They saw that the leaders of this movement did that. And so I think there are good reasons, and I'll just give a whole list of them on that website. You can take a look at that article. It's also hyperlinked to all the other articles. I've written probably 6 articles on the martyrdoms. Again, these are just articles. The best research, I think, on this, and it's very fair, is Sean McDowell's The Fate of the Apostles, examining the martyrdom accounts of the closest followers of Jesus. And I know it's expensive, but it's worth it if you're interested in this topic. It is by far the best book out there on the subject, in my opinion.
And I believe the latest edition of Evidence That Demands a Verdict has a chapter in there by Sean on that.
That's a good point. Actually, that's a very good point, because I think that's a cheaper book. So you might be able to kind of sneak that in. I don't want to do it. Okay, so
you want Sean to get the big sales.
Yeah, well, to be honest, I mean, like in the end, all the warts and pimples of the historical evidence is in that book, Fate of the Apostles. And I think we need to know that, right? I get all the time people will make videos about me and make arguments that, oh, you can't trust papers. Ignatius, you can't trust what evidence we have. And I've tried to address that in the book. You know, what is the downside to using a chain of custody involving manuscript evidence we have of the earliest church fathers? Because that manuscript evidence is probably even less well preserved than the Gospels were, right? So can I trust that? Well, are we suggesting then that there is a multi-generational, multi-tiered, multi-regional conspiracy involving hundreds of people who are faking manuscript? It gets to me, it becomes even more and more unreasonable. If the clearest, plainest reading is just to kind of connect these dots, it seems to me.
Yeah, and especially when it comes to like the martyrdom accounts, it's always helpful that like you don't have to invoke miracles and stuff to get to that these people were martyred. So when people are like adding like advanced conspiracy theories to get out of that, then it really looks like they're just trying to avoid the conclusion of the resurrection, because they know where that evidence, at least what it could indicate, possibly.
Yeah, and I'm trying to look at this as you're talking about this. I'm trying to look at, because one of the things you're going to encounter is this idea that there was no real persecution of even the earliest Christians. Okay, you have to deny a lot of historical evidence in order to argue against, because what you have is, starting very early, you have a history of commitment to martyrdom that to me makes the most sense if they were seeing this on the part of those who presented the gospel to them for the first time. They wanted to be like their masters. And I think that in the end, that's still the best and most reasonable inference.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but that would give a really good explanation for why Christians were so willing to be martyred, because you got to have an explanation for that.
Yeah, I wrote about this in an article called "Were the Early Christians Really Persecuted?" Because what you'll see is that it starts super early. The gospel authors already are anticipating the kind of persecution they're going to see. And you see this in Matthew 24, John 15, John 16. It's Jesus warning his followers, hey, you're about to get your rear ends kicked. Just as much as they hated me, they're going to hate you. Then you see in the book of Acts that it's already happening. You see Peter and John are arrested in the book of Acts. Stephen is stoned to death in the book of Acts. The believers are persecuted as a group. James, the brother of John, is martyred. Members are pulled from their homes. They're taken to prison. So you see this stuff in the book of Acts already early on. And then the next level you see is what are it's described personally in the other letters. You'll see, for example, and in Acts, Paul says in Acts that he's being charged and challenged by the Hellenists. He says in Antioch that they're being persecuted. So you'll see that even Luke is describing this kind of persecution in detail. The second generation, the third generation of Christian authors, Clement of Rome, talks about how Peter endured, quote unquote, not one but many labors, and thus having borne his testimony, went to his appointed place of glory. Ignatius describes Paul as a martyr. Polycarp describes Paul as a martyr. And the rest of the apostles, he says, quote unquote, also as martyrs. So you'll see this even in the second generation. Then you see that the second generation of disciples are martyred just as were the first. And you'll see this described by subsequent authors. Clement is banished from Rome by Emperor Trajan. He's forced to work in a stone quarry. Ignatius was martyred in the Roman Colosseum. Polycarp is reportedly martyred, along with 6 others by Antoninus Pius. Justin Martyr is persecuted and prosecuted. And so you'll see this over and over again. So the rich history of martyrdom that you see in the earliest generations. Now, what you could argue, oh, you know what? For the same reason I don't trust the Gospels, I don't trust any church fathers writing either. Okay, so basically you're going to throw everything under. By the way, this level of malevolence toward ancient documents is really unique to the Christian documents, right? Because you would never treat multi-generational documents in any movement with the same amount of skepticism as you're treating this. As a matter of fact, you would see multi-generational documents about an act or about an event in any other movement as further confirmation of the reliability of the first claims. But here what you see is, no, they're not only is that first guy a liar, that second guy's a liar, that third guy's a liar, that fourth guy's a liar. Although there are different parts of the world facing different pressures, speaking different languages, they're all involved in an elaborate conspiracy to lie about this. Okay. I mean, I certainly can see that's the case you're going to make, but I don't know that you would do that against any other claim in history. As a matter of fact, if you took out the miraculous events of the New Testament, just be honest about this. If Jesus is just a teacher like Baha'u'llah, he's a teacher like any other ancient sage who never worked a miracle ever, never rose from the dead, just a dude in the first century, said a lot of nice things. That Sermon on the Mount thing was pretty cool. And that's all he is. He's just a guy who said nice things. Do you think anyone would challenge the historicity of Jesus in his words if that was all he did? I think there'd be so much manuscript evidence, and each generation of manuscript evidence would be counted as a way of affirming the accounts. This is not based on anything other than a presuppositional bias against the miraculous. Because I think that if we're really honest with ourselves, if the only claims Christians made were of an ancient man who taught some proverbs, and we had all the same manuscript evidence, nobody would doubt the existence or the reliability of those documents or the existence of Jesus.
Right.
It is the supernatural aspect of Jesus that is the linchpin, it's the starting point for all this skepticism.
Absolutely.
Yep, consistency.
Yep. Well,
Yeah.
we're up on our 1 hour. We're a little over, which is awesome. Thank you so much, Detective Wallace, for deciding to come on. This was great. We'd love to have you back sometime.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I'd love to come back. Let me know when.
Okay, sure will. So real quick before we depart, I want you to plug your website, your and resources and stuff. Just tell us a little bit about that and where we can find you.
This is the part of the video where everyone just turns it off. Says, see you later. This is already over now. But I will say that you can reach me at coldcasechristianity.com, and we have a phone app, just the Cold Case Christianity phone app. That's where I can field questions. We have a chat room there. You can jump in with me and ask any question you have. And I've got a book I'm working on now, which is the most, I think it's an unusual way of making a case for the historicity and deity of Jesus. I'm making it as though every New Testament manuscript had been destroyed. What would we know about Jesus, and what kind of case could we make about Jesus just from the fuse that burns up to Jesus and the fallout that occurs after the explosion known as Jesus? This is a process we do in many criminal cases where we have no body, and I'm calling the book Person of Interest. It took me about 14 months to research, about 6 months to write, because I had research which pretty much wrote itself, and then about 3.5 months to illustrate with about 400 illustrations. So that book will be out in September. It's called Person of Interest, is being published by Zondervan.
All right. Can I get a signed copy?
Of course.
All right, Detective Wallace. Well, thank you so much again for being here with us. David, you got anything to wrap up with?
I just want to say I didn't know anything about this, and now I'm stoked for this book because that is an awesome way of approaching the whole issue, I think, because that's conceding a lot, and so it's impressive that you can still make the case. But yes,
you'd be surprised with what you can know. Yeah, in order to erase Jesus from our collective consciousness from history. You have to do a lot more than destroy Bibles. Turns out most of the stuff that we treasure as atheists, we are indebted to Jesus for it to begin with. So,
yeah.
Awesome. Well, it has been an absolute pleasure. It's been, great to meet you. Awesome experience for me. And so, yeah, just I'll echo Russell and say thank you so much for coming on.
hey, thanks, David and David, both of you. I appreciate it.
Take care.
All right. See you guys later. All right.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.